Another way that we can create objects in JavaScript is by using the create method. This was introduced in ECMAScript 5, and we use it by calling object.create. This is considerably longer than an object literal, but we gain a lot of power with this method because it allows us to create objects that are based upon other objects. For example, we have an object called foo, which is set to an object literal, and we know that that is the equivalent of newing up the object constructor. Well, we can get the same type of results by using object.create and then passing in object.prototype. Of course, we typically wouldn't want to do this because it's a lot less typing to just use an object literal. But let's say that we have a more complex object. I have an object called John Doe, which has a first name, a last name property, and a say name property. Now, technically, JavaScript does not have methods. It has properties that contain a function object. So I will use the terminology of method as well as property when referring to what is logically a method. Now let's say that we want to take this John Doe object and we want to create a Jane Doe object that also has a first name and a last name property as well as a say name method. Of course, we could just copy and paste this code and make the necessary modifications, or we could use the create method and use our John Doe object as a basis. So let's create a variable called Jane Doe and let's call object.create. We'll pass the John Doe object as the first argument, but we also want to set new values for the first name and last name properties. Otherwise, our Jane Doe object is going to have a first name of John and a last name of Doe. And really, the last name is fine. So really, all we need to change is the first name property. So we can pass a second argument that contains all of our properties. And these properties are object descriptors. So inside of this object, we are going to have a descriptor for first name, and we are going to set the value to Jane. And once we do that, we will have a Jane Doe object that has a first name of Jane, a last name of Doe, and the say name method is going to return a string that says my name is Jane Doe. So we can see the results with an alert call. So let's first call johndoe.sayname, and then let's also alert janedoe.sayname. And we will see these results in the browser. So let's switch over to Chrome. I'm going to refresh the page, and we are first going to see an alert box that says my name is John Doe, and then the second alert box is going to say my name is Jane Doe. Now let's go back to our Jane Doe object and let's add another property. Let's add a method called greet. This method is going to accept a name, and then it's simply going to return a string that says hello, comma, and then the provided name. This modification is only for the Jane Doe object. The John Doe object is still the same as it was before. But let's create another object, another person, which we'll call Jim Smith, and we'll use the Jane Doe object as a basis. So call object.create, pass Jane Doe, but then we need to supply new values for the first name and last name properties. So we can do first name and set the value to Jim, and then we want the last name to be set to Smith. So value is Smith. And let's change this greet method. Instead of a string value, let's pass in a person object, or at least one of these objects that has a first name and a last name. And we can change name to person.firstname. So now when we make our alert calls, let's have our Jane Doe object also call greet, and we will pass in John Doe. So Jane Doe is going to greet John Doe, and let's let Jim Smith first of all say his name, and then let's let him greet Jane Doe. So let's go back to the browser and refresh. We will see our first alert box that says my name is John Doe. Then we will not get anything because there must be an error somewhere. So let's fire up the console. Let's see what error we have. Property greet of object is not a function. And I know why that is. The greet property needs to be an object descriptor. So we need to put an opening curly brace there, set value to the function, and then close the curly brace. Now we can go back to the browser, refresh. There we have our first alert box. We have our second, my name is Jane Doe, hello John, and then my name is Jane Smith, hello Jane. What the object.create method actually does is build a prototype chain. The object that you pass as the first argument is set as the prototype for whatever object you're creating. So the Jane Doe object's prototype is John Doe, whereas Jim Smith's prototype is Jane Doe. And we can easily test this with the proto property. Now this is a property that we shouldn't use except when we absolutely need to. Let's write this to the console and we'll say Jane Doe.proto equals John Doe. Let's also test Jim Smith. Jim Smith.proto is going to equal Jane Doe. So let's save this, let's go back to the browser. Let's refresh, and in the console we see true and true. Now obviously as we are writing our code, we don't want to always use object.create. And really the same is true for object literals. If we want to create multiple objects that have this same interface with first name, last name, and say name, and then other objects that have a greet property, then we'll want to put that creation code inside of a function. And that's as easy as wrapping a function around the creation code. But we also have another pattern called the constructor, which we will look at in the next lesson.